The neighborhood had been designed to erase individuality. Every home followed the same visual script, written years earlier by developers who believed uniformity equaled value. Rooflines mirrored one another, fences followed identical measurements, and paint colors were restricted to a narrow range of approved neutrals that blended seamlessly into the background. From a distance, the street looked calm, orderly, and expensive. From up close, it felt controlled. The Homeowners Association had ruled the neighborhood for more than a decade, and its authority had never been questioned. Rules were enforced quietly at first, then aggressively as residents learned that resistance only brought more scrutiny. Over time, compliance became automatic. People trimmed their lawns an inch shorter than required, parked their cars exactly where permitted, and repainted their homes before anyone asked. It was easier that way. Easier than fines. Easier than letters. Easier than becoming a problem. At the center of that authority stood the HOA president, a woman who treated the rulebook less like a guideline and more like a personal mandate. She believed order was fragile and that without constant enforcement, chaos would creep in through small cracks. A trash bin left out too long. A flower pot in the wrong shade. A mailbox that leaned slightly off-center. To her, these were not minor issues. They were warnings. Her afternoon walks were not casual strolls. They were inspections. She memorized house numbers, tracked repeat offenders, and carried a mental map of past violations. The neighborhood, in her eyes, was something to be guarded. Control was not just her responsibility, it was her identity. That identity was challenged the moment she turned the corner and saw the house. It was not loud. It was not neon. It did not scream for attention. But it was undeniably different. The home had been repainted in a deep slate blue color, darker than the approved palette and rich enough to catch the light in a way the surrounding beige and gray homes never did. In the morning sun, it looked refined. In the evening, it looked bold. Either way, it stood out. The president stopped walking. Difference, in this neighborhood, was a threat. She stood there longer than necessary, eyes narrowing as she compared the color to the mental list she carried of approved shades. It was close, but not close enough. The rulebook was clear. Close did not count. Compliance was binary. You were either within the rules or you were not. By the time she returned home, the decision had already been made. The first violation notice was issued within days. It was polite in tone, wrapped in the language of community standards and shared values. The letter referenced aesthetic harmony and long-term property value, carefully avoiding anything that sounded personal. A small fine was attached, positioned as motivation rather than punishment. The expectation was simple: repaint the house or bring the color into compliance. The homeowner did not respond. No email. No call. No explanation. The silence unsettled the HOA president more than anger would have. Most residents reacted immediately, apologizing or promising correction. This homeowner did nothing. The house remained blue. The lawn stayed trimmed. Life went on as if the letter had never existed. A second notice followed, this one firmer. The fine increased. Deadlines were emphasized. Consequences were outlined more clearly. Still, there was no response. To the HOA president, this was no longer about paint. It was about defiance. She began documenting the house more frequently, photographing it from multiple angles, logging dates and times. The violation file grew thicker. Each unanswered notice felt like a challenge to her authority, and authority was something she could not afford to lose. The HOA had rules precisely so no one could decide which ones mattered. Other residents noticed the attention. Whispers began to circulate. Some admired the quiet resistance, though none said so openly. Others worried that the association was escalating something trivial into a spectacle. The blue house became a landmark, a subtle reminder that someone, somewhere, was pushing back. The homeowner, meanwhile, remained invisible in the conflict. He attended no meetings. He made no public statements. From the outside, it appeared as though he simply did not care. In reality, every letter was being opened, read, and archived. Every fine was being logged. The silence was intentional. The HOA president interpreted that silence as weakness. Within weeks, late fees were added. The language of the notices shifted from corrective to disciplinary. Phrases like continued non-compliance and enforcement action appeared more frequently. Copies of the violation were entered into HOA records, ensuring that the issue would not fade quietly. What the HOA did not know was that the homeowner had expected this confrontation long before the paint was ever chosen. The color was not impulsive. It was calculated. The decision had been made only after reviewing documents most residents never bothered to read, documents buried deep in closing packets and county archives. The house had not changed by accident. It had changed on purpose. As the fines mounted, the HOA board authorized stronger measures. Legal escalation was discussed. The idea of placing a lien was introduced casually, as though it were routine. For the president, this was the natural progression of enforcement. Rules existed to be obeyed, and consequences existed to ensure that obedience. The street itself remained quiet, unaware that it had become the foundation of a conflict no one fully understood yet. Cars passed. Children played. Neighbors waved politely. And the blue house remained exactly as it was, untouched by the pressure building around it. To the HOA president, it was a symbol of disrespect. To the homeowner, it was bait. And beneath it all lay a truth no one in the association had questioned in years: the authority they believed they held over the street had never truly been proven. The first move had been made. The war had begun. What the HOA president viewed as a simple enforcement issue was, beneath the surface, the product of years of unchecked control. The association had not always operated with such rigidity. In its early days, rules existed mostly on paper, referenced only when disputes arose. But as the neighborhood aged and leadership changed, enforcement became more aggressive. Power consolidated quietly, reinforced by routine compliance and the absence of resistance. The board meetings reflected this shift. Attendance dwindled over time as residents grew accustomed to decisions being made without them. Most trusted that the HOA knew what it was doing. Others simply did not want the attention that came with speaking up. Silence became consent, and consent became precedent. The HOA president thrived in this environment. She had inherited a system that rewarded firmness and punished hesitation. Each successfully enforced rule validated her approach. Each fine paid without challenge reinforced her belief that the association's authority was absolute. Over the years, that belief hardened into certainty. The Blue House disrupted that certainty. Behind the scenes, the association's enforcement mechanisms began to grind into motion. Internal logs were updated. Compliance timelines were calculated. Standard escalation procedures were followed with mechanical precision. To the board, this was routine. The homeowner had violated an aesthetic rule, ignored correction notices, and now faced consequences. There was no room in that framework for interpretation. What none of them discussed was why the homeowner remained silent. While the HOA documented violations, the homeowner reviewed history. His relationship with the neighborhood predated most of the current board. He had purchased the property with an unusual level of diligence, reviewing not just HOA covenants but original plats, development agreements, and county records that most buyers skimmed or ignored. What he found back then had stayed with him. The street had a complicated past. Long before the HOA asserted control, the road had been financed privately during early development phases. Ownership had been structured through temporary legal entities designed to manage construction and maintenance. When the neighborhood was completed, responsibility for the street was assumed rather than formally transferred. Over time, that assumption solidified into tradition. Tradition, however, is not law. The homeowner understood that distinction. He knew the HOA's authority relied less on clear legal ownership and more on the perception of control. As long as no one questioned it, the association could act as though the street belonged to them. That illusion was powerful, but fragile. As fines increased, the HOA president's frustration grew. She interpreted the homeowner's silence as arrogance. Each unanswered notice felt like an erosion of her influence. She began referencing the case frequently during board discussions, framing it as an example of why strict enforcement mattered. The Blue House became a cautionary tale, used to justify broader crackdowns on minor violations. Other residents felt the pressure. Notices increased across the neighborhood. Rules were enforced more aggressively. What had begun as one dispute quietly expanded into a general tightening of control. The HOA president believed strength would discourage rebellion. Instead, it planted doubt. The homeowner continued to do nothing publicly, but internally his preparation deepened. He revisited county offices, pulled archived documents, and confirmed details that had once seemed theoretical. Each record reinforced the same conclusion: the HOA had never been granted ownership or formal jurisdiction over the street itself. That realization reframed the conflict entirely. The paint was no longer the issue. The fines were no longer the threat. The dispute was about whether the HOA actually had the power it claimed. When the HOA authorized further escalation, including legal consultation, the homeowner anticipated the move. He understood how enforcement worked. It depended on momentum, on intimidation, on the belief that resistance would cost more than compliance. What the HOA did not understand was that resistance, when grounded in documentation, shifts momentum entirely. The homeowner's first formal response was deliberately modest. He did not dispute the paint rule directly. Instead, he requested clarification. Proof. Evidence of the HOA's authority over the street as it applied to aesthetic enforcement. The request was polite, technical, and precise. It unsettled the board. Such questions had not been asked before. The association's legal counsel responded with broad language drawn from governing documents, citing general authority and past practice. The answer avoided specifics. The homeowner noticed. He followed up with a second request, this time attaching excerpts from historical records that suggested ownership had never been transferred. Again, the tone remained calm. There was no accusation, only inquiry. The HOA president dismissed the correspondence as stalling. She believed engaging with it would legitimize defiance. To her, authority did not need to be proven, it needed to be enforced. But enforcement without certainty carries risk. As the exchange continued, unease spread among board members. The idea that the HOA's authority rested on assumption rather than documentation was uncomfortable. If the homeowner was right, years of enforcement could be questioned. Refunds, legal exposure, and reputational damage loomed quietly in the background. Outside the boardroom, neighbors began paying attention. Conversations shifted. Some residents revisited old grievances, fines they had paid without question. Others wondered what else the HOA controlled without legal grounding. The blue house stood unchanged, increasingly symbolic. It represented not just resistance, but the possibility that the rules governing the neighborhood were not as solid as everyone had believed. The HOA president doubled down. Escalation plans moved forward. Certified letters were prepared. Legal pressure was framed as inevitable. What she did not realize was that every step forward brought the association closer to a question it could no longer avoid. Who really owned the street, and what authority did that ownership grant? The struggle beneath the surface had begun to emerge, and once exposed, it could not be ignored. As the dispute deepened, the conflict began to stretch beyond paperwork and authority, reaching into the emotional fabric of the neighborhood. What had started as a disagreement over paint quietly transformed into a test of identity, pride, and fear, on both sides of the divide. For the HOA president, the situation became personal. Her role had long been intertwined with her sense of purpose. Enforcing rules was not merely administrative, it was how she justified her position, how she maintained relevance in a community that rarely thanked her for keeping order. The blue house threatened more than aesthetics. It threatened the narrative that her leadership was necessary. Each unanswered letter felt like dismissal. Each unchanged brushstroke of slate blue paint felt like an insult. She began to internalize the resistance, convincing herself that if this homeowner succeeded, the authority she had built would unravel. The fear was not abstract. She imagined meetings spiraling out of control, residents questioning decisions, and the slow erosion of respect that had taken years to establish. That fear hardened into resolve. Her enforcement efforts intensified. The case was referenced repeatedly as justification for stricter oversight throughout the neighborhood. More inspections were scheduled. Minor violations that once might have been overlooked were suddenly documented. The HOA president believed that demonstrating strength would restore order and discourage others from testing boundaries. But strength, when driven by insecurity, often reveals cracks rather than hides them. For the homeowner, the experience unfolded very differently. His resistance was quiet, almost invisible, but deeply intentional. He understood that emotional reactions would only empower the HOA. Anger would be dismissed as defiance. Frustration would be framed as guilt. Silence, on the other hand, forced the association to expose itself. He had lived in the neighborhood long enough to understand the unspoken rules. He knew which neighbors feared attention and which ones quietly resented the HOA's reach. He had watched others comply reluctantly, paying fines simply to avoid prolonged conflict. Those memories shaped his strategy. The paint was never about provocation for its own sake. It was about drawing a line that could not be crossed without consequence. By choosing a color that was tasteful yet technically non-compliant, he had created a scenario where enforcement would be inevitable. And enforcement, he knew, required legitimacy. Emotionally, the pressure was real. Each escalation carried risk. Liens, legal fees, and public scrutiny were not abstract threats. He understood the cost of being wrong. But his confidence did not come from stubbornness. It came from documentation. From knowing that the foundation beneath the HOA's authority was weaker than it appeared. As weeks passed, the neighborhood atmosphere shifted. Residents who had once avoided HOA drama found themselves emotionally invested. The blue house became a conversation starter, a quiet symbol of resistance that people referenced cautiously. Some admired the homeowner's resolve. Others worried about retaliation spilling over into stricter enforcement for everyone. These divided reactions created invisible bridges, connections of shared anxiety and curiosity. The dispute was no longer isolated. It had become communal. The HOA president sensed this shift and interpreted it as a challenge to her leadership. She doubled down emotionally, convincing herself that yielding even slightly would validate dissent. Her communications grew firmer. Her tone less conciliatory. The possibility that she might be wrong became unthinkable. Behind closed doors, board members felt the strain. Some questioned the escalation privately. Others worried about the legal implications of pushing too hard. Yet few spoke openly. Challenging the president felt risky, and the habit of silence was deeply ingrained. The homeowner's next move was subtle but emotionally resonant. He stopped responding entirely. No letters. No emails. No follow-ups. The silence was absolute. This absence of reaction created a vacuum the HOA could not ignore. Without visible resistance, the association was forced to justify its actions publicly. Each escalation had to stand on its own merit. Each notice had to explain itself. Emotionally, this shifted the balance. The HOA president was now chasing compliance rather than commanding it. Her authority, once assumed, now required demonstration. Residents noticed the strain. Meetings grew tense. Attendance increased. Questions were asked cautiously, then more openly. The blue house loomed in the background of every discussion, a reminder that the association's power was being tested. For the homeowner, this phase was about endurance. He understood that emotional fatigue often determined outcomes long before legal decisions were made. The HOA needed to feel pressure, to confront uncertainty, doubt, and internal conflict. He did not seek victory through confrontation. He sought it through patience. As enforcement actions moved closer to formal legal steps, the emotional stakes reached a tipping point. Pride collided with fear. Control collided with doubt. The HOA president's determination became inseparable from her identity, making retreat psychologically impossible. And in that refusal to step back, she unknowingly built the bridge that would lead directly to her downfall. The conflict had moved beyond rules and paint. It had become a story about power, vulnerability, and the quiet strength of restraint. The next escalation would no longer be emotional alone. It would be irreversible. The shift from private enforcement to public exposure happened gradually, then all at once. What had once been contained within letters, emails, and closed-door board discussions began spilling into shared spaces where authority could no longer hide behind procedure. The HOA's actions were no longer just administrative steps. They were becoming a public performance. The certified notice arrived as expected, formal and unmistakable. It outlined the association's intent to escalate enforcement if compliance was not achieved. The language was careful, polished by legal review, and framed to appear inevitable. It was meant to intimidate, to remind the homeowner that the HOA possessed tools far more powerful than fines. Instead, it did the opposite. The homeowner responded, not emotionally, not defensively, but decisively. For the first time, the conflict moved out of private correspondence and into formal record. He submitted a documented challenge questioning the HOA's jurisdiction over the street itself. The filing was precise, unemotional, and supported by historical records. It did not accuse. It asked. That distinction mattered. Once the question existed on record, the HOA could no longer dismiss it as stubbornness. Jurisdiction was not a matter of opinion. It was either valid or it was not. The board reacted with visible unease. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Legal counsel was contacted repeatedly. The tone of discussions shifted from confidence to caution. What had once been treated as routine enforcement was now a potential liability. The HOA president resisted the change. She framed the challenge as an attack on the association itself, warning that conceding ground would invite chaos. To her, public doubt was more dangerous than private error. She argued that the association had enforced rules for years without challenge and that history itself validated their authority. But history, without documentation, offered little protection. As the dispute became known, residents began to pay attention in ways they never had before. Attendance at HOA meetings increased sharply. People who had not spoken in years listened closely, not because they cared about paint, but because they recognized what was at stake. If the HOA could be wrong about this, it could be wrong about other things too. The Blue House became an unspoken focal point. No speeches referenced it directly, yet its presence shaped every discussion. The question lingered in the room like static: what happens if the HOA does not own what it claims to control? The homeowner's challenge triggered a deeper review. County offices were contacted. Archived records were requested. Old plats and development agreements were pulled from storage. Each document introduced uncertainty rather than clarity. The street's ownership trail was fragmented, buried beneath decades of assumptions. Responsibility had been passed informally, maintenance handled without formal transfer, authority exercised without verification. The HOA had inherited control without ever proving it. This uncertainty began to fracture the board internally. Some members advocated caution, urging suspension of enforcement until ownership could be confirmed. Others feared that pausing would appear weak. The HOA president pushed forward, convinced that hesitation would embolden resistance. Her stance hardened. Notices continued to be issued. The language grew sharper. References to liens and legal remedies became explicit. The pressure intensified, not because the HOA was confident, but because it was afraid. Public sentiment shifted further. Residents whispered in hallways and shared concerns quietly. Old grievances resurfaced. Fines once accepted without question were re-examined in a new light. The idea that the HOA's authority rested on assumption rather than proof unsettled many. The homeowner remained publicly silent, allowing the process to unfold. His challenge had achieved its purpose. It forced scrutiny. It compelled transparency. And it shifted the burden of proof. The HOA president, sensing control slipping, attempted to reassert dominance through procedure. She emphasized rules, deadlines, and consequences. Yet every reminder of authority only drew more attention to the unanswered question beneath it. Who granted that authority in the first place? As the review progressed, the possibility of error grew harder to ignore. Legal counsel cautioned restraint. The board hesitated. Momentum slowed. The conflict had crossed a threshold. It was no longer a private dispute between an HOA and a homeowner. It was a public challenge to the legitimacy of the association's power. And once authority is forced into the light, it must either prove itself, or collapse. The next phase would bring answers the HOA was not prepared to face. The answer arrived quietly, without drama or ceremony, carried in official language that left no room for interpretation. What weeks of debate, pressure, and posturing had obscured was finally reduced to a matter of record. The county's findings were complete, and they told a story the HOA had never bothered to read. The street did not belong to the association. It never had. The ownership trail, once fully assembled, revealed a long-forgotten truth buried beneath decades of assumption. When the neighborhood was first developed, the road had been constructed and financed privately. Temporary entities were formed to manage its creation, maintenance, and liability during development. When construction ended, those entities dissolved, but the street itself was never formally transferred. No deed assignment. No jurisdictional handoff. No legal bridge between assumption and authority. For years, the HOA had enforced rules tied directly to that street, front-facing aesthetics, parking, visibility, compliance, without ever possessing the legal standing to do so. Control had existed only because no one had challenged it. Until now. The county's response was definitive. The street was neither HOA property nor municipal. It existed in a legal gray zone, privately owned under a dormant structure that predated the association entirely. The HOA's authority stopped at the property lines, not the pavement beyond them. When the board received the findings, the reaction was immediate and severe. Emergency meetings were called. Legal counsel reviewed the documents repeatedly, searching for loopholes that did not exist. Every interpretation led to the same conclusion: the association's enforcement actions tied to the street were legally vulnerable. For the HOA president, the revelation was destabilizing. The foundation of her authority, routine, enforcement, certainty, collapsed in a single moment. Years of confidence were rendered irrelevant by one undeniable fact. The street she had patrolled, cited, and controlled was never hers to govern. The implications spread quickly. If the HOA lacked authority over the street, then every fine issued under that assumption was questionable. Aesthetic violations. Parking penalties. Notices issued for visibility and frontage compliance. All of it rested on a claim the HOA could not support. The blue house was no longer the problem. It was the proof. The homeowner submitted the county's findings into HOA records without commentary. He did not gloat. He did not demand immediate apology. The documents spoke clearly enough on their own. The board had no viable response. Enforcement actions against the homeowner were quietly withdrawn. Fines were erased from the ledger. Threats of liens disappeared without explanation. The association moved swiftly to contain the damage, but containment was no longer possible. Word spread rapidly through the neighborhood. What had once been speculation was now confirmation. Residents began requesting records. Old fines were questioned. Past enforcement actions were re-examined with new eyes. The HOA president's influence eroded almost overnight. Her certainty, once intimidating, now appeared reckless. Decisions that had gone unquestioned for years were suddenly framed as overreach. Her refusal to acknowledge doubt earlier now looked less like strength and more like denial. The homeowner remained largely absent from the fallout. His role had never been to dismantle the HOA publicly. It had been to expose the truth quietly and allow its consequences to unfold. The revelation changed the power dynamic permanently. The HOA could no longer rely on assumption. Authority now required verification. Control required consent. The street remained exactly as it always had, same pavement, same curves, same quiet, but its meaning had shifted. It was no longer a symbol of HOA dominance. It was evidence. The association faced an unavoidable reckoning. Either it would confront the limits of its authority and reform, or it would collapse under the weight of its own assumptions. The unexpected revelation had done what confrontation never could. It had ended the illusion. The aftermath unfolded more slowly than the conflict itself, but its effects were far more enduring. Once the truth about the street's ownership became undeniable, the HOA could no longer operate as it once had. The association entered a period of reckoning, forced to confront not only a single mistake, but a culture built on unchecked authority. The first changes were procedural. Enforcement actions tied to the street were formally suspended. Notices were withdrawn, records amended, and internal logs quietly corrected. The association avoided public announcements, hoping to minimize attention, but the damage had already spread beyond what silence could contain. Residents who had once accepted fines without question began requesting documentation. Old violations resurfaced. Payments made years earlier were scrutinized under a new lens. What had seemed like isolated grievances now appeared connected by a single flaw, authority exercised without proof. The HOA board struggled to regain stability. Legal counsel advised restraint and transparency, urging the association to pause enforcement until jurisdiction could be clearly defined. Committees were formed to review governing documents. Consultants were brought in to assess risk and recommend reform. At the center of it all stood the HOA president, diminished and isolated. The confidence that once defined her leadership had evaporated. Decisions she had defended fiercely were now liabilities. Her refusal to question assumptions early on was quietly acknowledged as a catalyst for the crisis. Her resignation came without spectacle. No announcement framed it as accountability, and no apology accompanied her departure. She stepped away citing exhaustion, but the meaning was clear to everyone watching. Authority, when rooted in certainty rather than truth, cannot survive exposure. The homeowner watched these developments from a distance. He did not seek recognition or validation. His victory was not measured in apologies or headlines, but in correction. The fines against him remained erased. His home stayed painted exactly as it was. The street remained beyond the HOA's reach. More importantly, the balance of power had shifted. The association, once confident in its dominance, became cautious. Enforcement slowed. Rules were revisited. Language softened. Where orders had once been issued, explanations now followed. Authority, stripped of assumption, became something that required justification. The street itself became the subject of formal discussion for the first time in decades. Options were debated openly, transferring ownership to the city, negotiating shared responsibility, or leaving it privately held with clearly defined limits. Each option required resident involvement, consent, and transparency. For many neighbors, the process was transformative. Participation increased. Meetings grew longer and more engaged. People who had once remained silent found their voices, encouraged by the knowledge that authority was not immutable. The blue house faded back into the background, no longer controversial, no longer symbolic of defiance. Its color blended into the mental landscape of the neighborhood, ordinary now that it was no longer forbidden. What remained was not the paint, but the lesson it had revealed. Power thrives on habit. When rules are followed without question, authority expands quietly. Over time, enforcement becomes identity, and identity resists correction. The HOA had not set out to overreach deliberately. It had simply never been challenged. The homeowner's restraint proved decisive. He did not confront emotion with emotion, nor power with noise. He allowed the system to reveal its own weakness. By demanding proof instead of permission, he shifted the burden back where it belonged. The moral impact lingered long after the dispute ended. Residents understood now that governance requires accountability. That compliance without clarity invites abuse. That rules, no matter how familiar, must rest on legitimate foundations. The HOA survived, but it was changed. Its authority was narrower, its reach restrained by documentation rather than assumption. The culture of fear that once defined enforcement softened into one of caution and consultation. The street looked the same as it always had. The pavement had not moved. The houses still stood in neat rows. Yet beneath that sameness lay a fundamental shift in understanding. Ownership matters. Authority must be earned. And sometimes, the quietest resistance reshapes an entire community. The conflict that began with an ugly paint fine ended with a lesson written into the neighborhood's history, a reminder that power, when left unquestioned, grows careless, but when challenged patiently, learns its limits.